Okay, now it's time to rehang our provisional cast on, so I'm just going to kind of organize my tails here a little bit. And you can see why you have to have a really high contrast yarn, so you can find your little blue bumps in there that need to be rehung. So the hardest part is locating all of your stitches. So I know I need 10 to rehang onto this other side of the foot, and make sure your grooves are pointing outward. I've made the mistake of rehanging them like this, and you can't knit on the smooth side, so I had to take them off and rehang them, so you don't want to do that. So go ahead and make sure that your grooves are facing outward. And I don't connect my loom at this point because I find it easier to squeeze them really close together to get my stitches rehung. So I always do this as many times as I've done it before on different knitting machines and also hand knitting. I always try to locate all of my stitches first. So before I start trying to hang them on the opposite loom, I need to locate them first. When you start pulling on one stitch, it's always going to tighten up the stitch next to it, and sometimes this stitch can really start sinking so far down in there that you don't see it, and you're tempted to grab that stitch here on this side, but the stitch is going toward the outside here. So what you do is you follow your waste yarn down, and then you can dig out the stitch where it's hiding down there. Let me see if I can zoom in a little more. So you follow the waste yarn down if you've lost the stitch, and wherever it goes down, it's down there somewhere between those two waste yarn loops. And that was the main reason why these rows have to be really loose. The very first row of your blue yarn or your main yarn needs to be loose so that they don't sink in too much. I needed to zoom back out again. I realized I wasn't in the camera. So what I was saying is we have to locate all of these stitches. And so the end that's opposite of your tails, these two stitches twist around each other. And so if you'll pull on the waste yarn, you can see where it goes in that little loop right there. That's your first stitch. And you follow the waste yarn down. This one is your next stitch. So we'll go to the other end and find the other trouble spot. So here's some waste yarn, and you would think that this would be a stitch right here. But if the tail starts moving out, you know that's not the stitch. So I'm checking the camera so I don't get out of the camera. Follow this waste yarn down, and this is going to be your first stitch on this end. So once you found the end stitches, you pretty much know you're not going to get lost. The main thing is you have to rehang all 10 stitches, because once we remove this waste yarn, then if you've missed a stitch somewhere, it will run down and you'll have to repair those stitches. And it's not fun to repair when you've got all these decreases going on there. It's almost better just to start the whole toe over again, and you don't want to do that. So I'm going to count and make sure I know where all 10 of these little blue loops are. So I've got 2 on each end, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, follow the waste yarn, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I know where all of my loops are. So I'm going to get the smooth side of the yarn or the loom to the inside, grooves to the outside. I'm going to kind of just hold them together just like that. So I can just grab this marker. Don't twist the stitch, just lay it on that peg. So it's already starting to tighten up there, as you can probably see. Let me see if I can zoom in without moving off of the field of view. I'm going to try to do my best not to move around too much. So I'm following this waste yarn down, and I'm making sure I have the last blue loop going toward the waste yarn. And I'm going to pick it up. Try not to split any of the waste yarn plies, because when you get ready to remove the waste yarn, it makes it harder to take it out. So I've got 2 of them hung. I'm going to follow this waste yarn down and pull this one up. This takes a little time, so if you're tired from shaping the toe, take a little break before you start this section. And I've grabbed too much of the waste yarn, so I'm trying my best to get it on there without splitting that waste yarn. So they're getting tighter and tighter as I go. So I'm really having to be careful. My dog is snoring over there. I don't know if you can hear it. All right. My stitches, as careful as I was to get them loose, they're still very tight. And the waste yarn, I keep grabbing and splitting it, so we may have a little difficulty getting the waste yarn off, but it's no big deal. I'm going to go ahead and film this whole thing because you need to see the difficulties that I have also. So if you have to open this up, you can do that and just roll it outwards to reach in there and get those stitches. And I'm holding this too far away from me, so that's making it a little harder for me too, because I want to stay in the camera. So I've got 2 pegs left, so here's one more bump, and I follow my waste yarn, and there's my last little blue bump. If you end up with a different number of pegs than you have stitches, then you're going to have to start over and figure out where you've missed a stitch, or if you've picked up too many loops or something like that. So you should have the same number of pegs as you do the main yarn bumps. I'm going to go ahead and take these markers off because they've done their job. Stitch holders, if you don't have this kind, you can use anything to mark these loops on the edge, a piece of yarn or whatever. So since this is such a tiny, tight little project, it's a little bit more difficult to link the looms. If you're doing a bigger project, you can get these looms opened out to where you can click those in together. But I could just kind of fold it a little bit on this end. So it is easier with a bigger slipper. These tinier ones are harder. And you could just try to knit in the round for a couple of rounds, but that's going to kind of mess your gauge up on the bottom. The other thing I failed to mention is before you link this together, make sure your working yarn is coming up through the middle, because if you get it caught between those 2 sections, then you won't be able to knit. So you want to make sure it's out and ready to work. These bunch of tails here can go down between the loom sections and get them out of the way. All right, so I'm going to leave it kind of scrunched up for a little while till I get a little more knitting on there. So for now, we're still ignoring these 2 little markers in the middle. Those are going to come into play when we're ready to start the gap for the opening for the foot to go in. But right now we are going to be knitting in the round, and we're going to keep knitting in the round until we've got half of the measurement of our foot where we're going to start the opening. So wherever you decide to let your opening start, whatever measurements you came up with on how you wanted to design your slipper, knit up to that point and stop, and then we'll start the gap. I'm going to go halfway, so I think I'll knit a couple of inches since this is not a real slipper. So I think if I do 2 inches before I start the gap, it'll give me enough to demonstrate the next step. So what I love about this loom is you can kind of maneuver it around to where it's more comfortable to knit in whatever section you're working on. So this is going to be my first peg of each round because my yarn is coming off there. This was the section we used to do the toe. So I'm going to continue in the round until I have about 2 inches of length, and I'm going to use a tape measure or a ruler of some kind, and I'm going to stick it inside of my slipper every now and then to measure. So that's how you keep track of the length. You don't have to count rows or find out a row gauge. You just measure as you go. But I would count the rounds so that you can do your next slipper the exact same number of rounds, so they'll be the same size. So start your rounds and knit half of the length that you need for your finished slipper. Okay, I've completed enough rounds to get to halfway the length of the sample that I'm making. It's close to 2 inches, so I'm going to stop. And you can see the nice shape of the toe. Our waist yarn is still attached at this point. I recommend waiting until you get the slipper off of the loom to deal with the waist yarn, so that if you have any drop stitches, you can catch them with a marker or something like that and repair them before they run too far. But that would be only if you accidentally missed a peg or something. So I'm going to start knitting by rows now. We're going to be knitting flat instead of in rounds. And that's going to be this part of the slipper. We're going to knit, there's the 2 pegs in the middle. Right here is the top of the slipper right here. So we're going to be knitting one direction and then coming back and making a gap in the middle of the slipper to get the foot in. So I ended my round and I knit this peg last. This was the first peg of my rounds, but we're going to be knitting flat now. So we're going to be knitting in rows, but I need to get my working yarn over to this first peg here. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit to that point. All right. So this is where our gap is going to be. That's why I put the 2 markers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first knit to the right, and I'm going to stop at this peg and leave a gap and then go back and stop at this peg. But the first stitch of every row is going to be skipped or slipped. It's going to be a slip stitch. And you simply just skip the peg. So each one of these pegs are only going to be knit every other row. So now I'm knitting from left to right, so I'm going to skip this peg and go ahead and knit all of the rest of them. So I'm going to go ahead and knit, and I'm going to meet you back when I get to that peg. Okay, I'm coming to the end of this row. I've got to knit the last peg. You have to be careful not to accidentally cross over and do this next peg. There should be no stitches in between these 2 pegs. So what I usually do is I'll look in the back each row and make sure I haven't closed my gap, because if you're watching TV or something like that and you're daydreaming, you may accidentally cross over, and then you'll end up having to rip out all those rows up to that point. You may look back there later and see some yarn going across and know that you accidentally crossed over. So now it's time for me to knit from the right to the left. So I'm going to skip this first peg. I'm not going to knit it. So I'm just going to skip it and continue to the left. And by skipping the first peg of each row, we're going to get that nice edge of the top edge of the slipper that I showed you. I'm going to continue knitting back and forth until I have another couple of inches on there, and that will give me enough of a sample to show you the next step. I've got about 4 inches completed, so that's enough for the sample, and I'm going to show you how to graft the heel. This is the seam across the back of the heel. So we need enough yarn to do this, so I'm just going to measure a couple of rounds here. It's probably more than I need, but I can always trim it if it's too much. I don't want to run out. So measure a long tail that you can sew with. Actually, we're going to be knitting the grafting. So here is the top of the foot with our gap, and you can see it on the inside. And what you have to try to pay attention to is when you're looking at these stitches, this is the front of the stitch going through that way, and this is the back of the stitch going down. So if you're using a tapestry needle to do this, you would stitch up through the first stitch and down through the second one. But I'm just going to be pulling my yarn up and down. So I'm going to be pulling rather than threading it through with a needle. So the first thing you do is you fold it in half as best you can with the top of the foot, which is this part right here, on one end. So we're going to be grafting these stitches together. So we're going to be a little bit different than the traditional Kitchener stitch in that we're not going to do the setup. The first 2 stitches are only going to have one pass of the yarn through them, and the last 2 stitches are only going to have one pass of the yarn. The rest of them are going to go, you'll be going through them twice. And by doing that, you're going to avoid the little bump on the side. If you want to see this done with hand knitting needles, there's some YouTube videos. Just do a search on Kitchener stitch without the bumps on the toes. Okay, so this marker belongs to this side, and this marker belongs to all the stitches on that side. So I can see that my yarn is attached to this peg here, so I'm going to do this side first. So we're going to be looking at these first 2 pegs. This is my outside peg because it has this little marker, and I know there's a gap right here. Eventually we'll be able to take this link out once we get the stitches bound off. So, but right now you're just going to have to maneuver it the best you can. So I'm going to come to the outside of peg number 1, peg number 2. I'm going to come to the outside, and I need to go through the front of the stitch. So I'm going to use my hook to go up. So that one has 1 stitch through it, or 1 strand. So it's up and off. Snug it up. Now we need to go down through the very next peg. Down. So it's up, off, and then down. So we're going to snug up the stitches as we go, and now we're going to work on the other side. So just maneuver your loom to where you're at the first and second peg. You're always counting from the outside peg. So here's my second marker. This is the outside peg. This is number 2. So I'm going to try my best at this point to snug as I go. If you wait till the end to do it, you're going to have all these loops, and you're going to have to adjust those stitches one by one. What you're wanting to have is a very smooth transition across the heel. So I'm coming to the outside of this first peg. Let me see if I can flatten that out where you can see it. Here's my outside peg. So I need to go up. Up, off, and then down on the very next peg. All right, this is where we cross back over to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and unlink this to make it easier to flatten out my loom. So I've got this link free, so I can go ahead and just disconnect it. So now it's time to work across to the other side. You can see where your tail is. If you have to stop in the middle of doing this, just always check your tail. Right now I'm not able to neaten this up very much. You don't want to pull so tight that you distort the stitches and make them smaller than the rest. You're trying to size them to where they look like the rest of the stitches. So here's my outside peg here, because this one is empty, so I'm going to come around to the outside of that one and go up through number 1, off, and then down through number 2, and stay, meaning it stays on the peg. Snug it up, cross over. Go to the outside of peg number 1, peg number 2. We're going to go up and off, down, and stay. I'm going to try to show you the whole thing unless I get interrupted. So you just keep repeating that, up and off, down and stay, and then neatening up your stitches as you go. So you want all of these stitches, the one where we added with the bind off and the stitches that we had knit before, you want them all about the same size. So stick your finger in there and then adjust any loopy things that you see. Now it's time to go across. Here's my outside peg, so that's 1 and 2. So I'm going to go, we don't need those anymore, they'll just get in the way. So I'm going to go up, off, down, and stay. Oops, I need to go to the outside, it makes it easier. Up and off, down, and stay. Go across, outside peg, up and off, down, and stay. Go across, up and off, down, and stay. Go across, up and off, down, and stay. Check your stitches. Up, off, down, and stay. All right, toward the end I start paying attention to how many pegs are left over and how many passes of the yarn. So when we get down to 4, then I'll explain something to you. So this is up and off, down and stay. So we have 5 pegs left. Up and off. Okay, so when I go down through this one, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 pegs left. When I go down through this one, it's going to have the one pass through it. Okay, but it's time to go across the other side. So this is the second pass through this peg. So that's up and off. I'll rearrange this here. Down and stay. So this peg has one pass through it. So these two. So remember that this peg has one pass already through it. We're just kind of keeping track now. So we need to go to the outside of it. Up and off. Down and stay. So this one has one pass through it, and remember this one already has one pass through it. So if you're sure of that, you're very sure it has a pass through it, then you can go ahead and drop them both off rather than doing the sequence over again. If you don't do that extra step at the end, you won't have the little bumps on the edge. So you're really only doing half of the process on either end of this. So that one's safe and this one should be. So if I did it correctly, there should be no stitches that are running. So it's a little bumpy there, but we'll fix that. So it should be a smooth transition from side to side. I can see that some of them are a little tighter in there, but if you're really careful, you can make all the stitches the same size across your join, and you won't be able to tell where the join is, but that's pretty invisible. Okay, we're going to use the tail to get rid of this little pointy heel here. This is something I do on a lot of my projects. So just take the tail and thread it onto a tapestry needle. You have to weave the ends in anyway, so you might as well fix the heel while you're doing it. So I'm going to shorten this a little bit. All right, what I'm going to do is just kind of scrunch that down with my thumb, and I'm going to just do a little gathering stitch in a spiral around the heel just to smooth that out a little bit. And just hide your stitches. Do it from the outside of your slipper so you can make sure that the stitches are hiding. And just tug on it just slightly until you shape it as you go, and that will smooth it out some. You can put your slipper on a sock blocker and steam that a little more to shape it, especially if you're giving it as a gift and you want it to look nice. Otherwise, you can just wear the slipper and eventually it will conform to your heel. But if you want it to look nice now, just do a little spiral here and just kind of gather that up. It's really hard to show on this tiny one, but you get the drift. All right, and when I make it back to the other side, I just tuck my needle into the inside of the slipper, and then I just weave in my ends. I'm not going to take the time to do that on camera. So you would weave your ends in so that the slipper could be washed and it would be secure. So now it's time to take a little break, and we're going to remove the waste yarn off of the bottom of the slipper. This is the part where you hope that you picked up all your provisional cast-on stitches and not left any out. So I like to keep a little stitch holder handy in case I see a stitch that I dropped. I can just hook onto it with this thing to stop it from running, and then I'll come back and repair the stitches. So if you were really careful with your hanging of your provisional stitches, then you probably won't have that problem. Let's hope not. So first thing I need to do is go from the opposite end to where all these tails are and go over here and find the last little loop of the waste yarn. And you want to pull it out away from your main stitches so that you don't cut the wrong thing. So pull it out and get your scissors and make sure you're only poking your scissors in to that waste yarn. All right, go back to the side where the tail is, down here at the end, and then just pull on that. And if I didn't split any stitches, then that should slide out easily. If it catches, then you may have to go in there and snip every stitch. Well, that just falls off just like that. And seeing all of that will steam out. Once you block the slipper, all of this will look nice. So that's where the provisional cast on was, and we put live stitches back on the loom and continued knitting. So that's why you can't see where one stopped, where the toe stopped and the rest of the body of the slipper started. So you take your tail that's over here by the toe, just thread a tapestry needle on it, run it to the inside of the slipper and weave the ends in securely. You can see our slip stitches on the edge of the slipper. That makes it really nice to crochet into, or you can hang these back on the loom and do a little technique like this with these little bobble stitches, and it only takes 4 pegs to do this. So I'll probably make a separate video showing how to rehang your project on the loom and do a little trim. You can do a cabled edge or a lot of things with this loom. It's so versatile. But all of this one was done completely on the loom. And like I said, you can just leave it plain or do any kind of edge that you want to for the top. But basically, this little slipper is complete.